My name is Hannah Brooks, and I never imagined that a single PDF file and a 3 a.m. click of the submit button would turn an entire empire of corruption into smoldering ashes. But when the compliance report he threw in the trash suddenly appeared on an SEC agent's desk, his career didn't just end, it was stripped bare in newspapers, on television, and before the eyes of those who once laughed when I warned them. This isn't just an office story, this is a purge. I've always been the kind of person who notices things others miss. Maybe it comes from growing up in a house where every penny mattered, where my father's business went under because he trusted the wrong people with the books. That experience carved something deep into my bones, a hatred for financial dishonesty that burns like acid in my chest whenever I see numbers that don't add up. At 38, I'd been the head of internal compliance at Granite Oak Holdings for 3 years. Our downtown Chicago office occupied the top 15 floors of a gleaming tower, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky like some monument to corporate ambition. From my corner office on the 12th floor, I could see Lake Michigan stretching endlessly toward the horizon, a view that usually calmed me during the most stressful audit seasons. Granite Oak specialized in private real estate investments, managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions. We were the kind of firm that wealthy clients trusted with their retirement funds, their children's college money, their dreams of financial security. That trust was supposed to be sacred. That's what made what I discovered so much worse. It started with a routine vendor audit in October. Nothing unusual, just the quarterly review of our top 50 suppliers, checking invoices against contracts, making sure we weren't overpaying for services or getting charged for work that was never completed. I'd done this same process dozens of times before, methodically cross-referencing purchase orders with delivery receipts, comparing quoted prices with actual charges. But this time, something caught my eye. A series of invoices from Meridian Consulting Services, a company I'd never heard of despite 3 years of reviewing our vendor files. The amounts weren't huge, $15,000 here, $22,000 there. But they appeared with suspicious regularity. Every month, like clockwork. Meridian would bill us for strategic advisory services or market analysis consulting. I pulled up our approved vendor list. Meridian wasn't on it. I checked our contracts database. Nothing. I searched our email system for any correspondence with Meridian. Not a single message. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. In compliance work, patterns like this usually meant one of two things. Either someone was very sloppy with their paperwork, or someone was very good at hiding something they shouldn't be doing. I decided to dig deeper. Over the next week, I traced every Meridian invoice back to its approval source. Each one had been authorized by the same person, Gregory Walters, our chief financial officer. Each payment had been processed through a subsidiary account that didn't appear on our main financial statements. Each invoice used language so vague that it could have meant anything or nothing. Gregory and I had what you might call a professional relationship. We'd worked together on several projects, and he'd always been pleasant enough, charming even. He had this way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room, a skill that served him well in client meetings and board presentations. But there was something about him that had always made me slightly uncomfortable. A smoothness that felt too polished, too practiced. The more I investigated Meridian, the more suspicious I became. I started staying late, using my administrative access to pull financial records that most employees couldn't see. I discovered that Meridian's invoices coincided perfectly with Granite Oak's most profitable quarters. When we had a good month, Meridian's bills mysteriously increased. When we had a slow month, their charges dropped proportionally. Even more troubling, I found a correlation between Meridian's invoicing patterns and Gregory's expense reports. Every time we paid Meridian for consulting services, Gregory would submit travel expenses for industry conferences or client meetings in expensive locations. Las Vegas, Miami, the Caribbean. Always first-class flights, always 5-star hotels. Always with vague justifications that technically met our travel policy requirements but felt excessive. I spent my weekends poring over bank records, vendor contracts, and expense reports. I stopped going out with friends, stopped dating, stopped doing anything except work and investigation. My small apartment became a command center of spreadsheets and printed documents, every surface covered with financial records that told a story I was beginning to understand. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Gregory had created a shell company, Meridian Consulting, that existed solely to receive payments from Granite Oak. The payments were disguised as legitimate business expenses, small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits, but frequent enough to add up to significant money over time. The cash would flow from Granite Oak to Meridian, and then presumably back to Gregory through some arrangement I couldn't quite trace. It was embezzlement, plain and simple, but it was embezzlement done by someone who understood our systems intimately, someone who knew exactly how to structure the theft to avoid detection, someone who had access to our approval processes, our accounting software, our internal controls. After 3 weeks of investigation, I had documented over $800,000 in suspicious payments to Meridian over the past 2 years. $800,000 of investor money, client money, money that belonged to people who trusted us to manage their financial futures responsibly. I felt sick. Not just angry, actually physically ill. These weren't abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. This was real money stolen from real people. Retired teachers, small business owners, families who had worked decades to save enough to invest with us. Gregory had looked them in the eye, shaken their hands, promised to protect their interests, and then systematically stolen from them. The worst part was how casual it all seemed. Gregory didn't act like someone carrying the weight of serious criminal activity. He still joked around the office, still bought rounds of drinks at company happy hours, still gave presentations about fiduciary responsibility and ethical leadership with a straight face. Either he was a sociopath, or he was so confident in his scheme that he genuinely believed he'd never be caught. I decided it was time to compile a formal report. This wasn't something I could handle quietly or informally. If I was right about what Gregory was doing, it was a federal crime that could destroy our company and devastate our clients. If I was wrong, I was about to accuse a senior executive of felony embezzlement based on circumstantial evidence and financial patterns. Either way, I had to document everything properly. I owed it to our clients, to our other employees, to everyone who depended on Granite Oak's integrity to do this the right way. I started working on the report in early November. It consumed my life completely. I would arrive at the office at 6 in the morning, work my regular compliance duties until 5, then stay until 10 or 11 at night working on the investigation. I brought stacks of financial records home every weekend, spreading them across my kitchen table like some obsessive detective trying to solve a complex murder case. The report grew longer every day. I documented every suspicious transaction, every questionable expense, every red flag I'd uncovered. I included screenshots of bank records, copies of invoices, charts showing the correlation between Meridian's billing patterns and Gregory's travel expenses. I cross-referenced everything with our internal policies, our fiduciary obligations, and relevant federal regulations. By the time I finished, the report was over 400 pages long. It read like a prosecutor's case file, methodically building an argument that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. I'd spent countless hours making sure every fact was correct. Every allegation was supported by evidence, every conclusion was logical and defensible. I printed 3 copies, one for my records, one for our CEO, and one for the board of directors. I also saved digital copies on my personal laptop and a secure cloud storage account, just in case. I'd learned enough about corporate cover-ups to know that important documents had a way of disappearing when powerful people wanted them gone. The night before I planned to submit the report, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what would happen next. Best case scenario, the company would investigate, find that I was right, and take appropriate action. Gregory would be fired, possibly prosecuted, and our client's money would be recovered. Granite Oak's reputation would take a hit, but we'd emerge stronger and more trustworthy. Worst case scenario, the company would close ranks around Gregory, dismiss my findings, and probably fire me for being a troublemaker. I could end up blacklisted in the industry, unable to find another compliance job. My career destroyed for doing what I thought was right, but I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. Every day I didn't report what I'd found was another day Gregory could steal more money. Another day innocent people's investments were being misappropriated. I had to act. I scheduled a meeting with Gregory for the following Friday afternoon. I figured I owed him the opportunity to explain himself before I went to senior management. Maybe there was some legitimate explanation I'd missed, some context that would make sense of the patterns I'd discovered. Maybe Meridian was a legitimate contractor and I'd somehow misunderstood their role in our operations. Deep down, I knew that wasn't true. But I wanted to give him the chance to come clean, to admit what he'd done and work with me to make things right. I still believed, naively, that people were fundamentally decent when confronted with their mistakes. Friday arrived gray and cold, typical Chicago November weather. I spent the morning reviewing my notes one final time, making sure I had all the key facts memorized. I wanted to be prepared for whatever Gregory might say, whatever excuses or explanations he might offer. His office was on the 14th floor, just 2 floors above mine, but in a completely different world. Where my space was functional and cluttered with compliance manuals and financial regulations, his was all dark wood and leather furniture, designed to impress clients and convey authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city, while expensive artwork and tasteful sculptures suggested wealth and sophistication. Gregory looked up from his computer when I knocked on his door, flashing that practiced smile that had always made me slightly uncomfortable. "Hannah, come in, come in. What brings you up to executive country?" I closed the door behind me and took a seat across from his desk. "I need to talk to you about something serious, Gregory. Something I discovered during the vendor audit." His expression shifted slightly, the smile becoming more guarded. "Oh? What kind of discovery?" I pulled out a folder containing the key findings from my investigation. "I've been reviewing our payments to Meridian Consulting Services. I can't find any record of how they were approved, what services they've provided, or why we're paying them hundreds of thousands of dollars." Gregory leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. For a moment, he said nothing, just studied my face with those calculating eyes. Then he laughed, a sound that was probably meant to be casual but came across as forced. "Meridian? Oh, that's ancient history. They did some market analysis work for us a while back. Competitive intelligence, client demographic studies, that sort of thing. Very specialized stuff. I've looked through our files, Gregory. There's no contract, no statement of work, no deliverables, just invoices for vague consulting services that happen to coincide with your travel expenses." The smile disappeared completely. "Hannah, I think you're reading too much into routine business transactions. Meridian is a boutique firm that does confidential work for several companies in our industry. The nature of their services requires a certain level of discretion." Discretion or secrecy? I opened the folder and pulled out a spreadsheet showing the correlation between Meridian's invoices and his expense reports. $800,000 over 2 years. Gregory. Always in amounts just below our automatic review thresholds. Always followed by your travel to expensive locations. Gregory stood up and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he stared out at the city below. When he turned back to face me, his expression was different, colder, more calculating. "Hannah, I'm going to give you some advice. You're a good compliance officer, but you're new to this level of corporate finance. Sometimes there are arrangements that don't fit neatly into your regulatory frameworks. Sometimes business gets done in ways that might look unusual to someone who doesn't understand the bigger picture." "What bigger picture?" "The picture where Granite Oak generates hundreds of millions in revenue and provides jobs for over 200 people. The picture where our clients see consistent returns on their investments because we're willing to do whatever it takes to stay competitive. The picture where everyone wins as long as everyone minds their own business." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Are you telling me to drop this investigation?" "I'm telling you to think carefully about what you're accusing me of and what the consequences might be if you're wrong. Or if you're right." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Gregory wasn't denying the embezzlement. He was warning me about what would happen if I exposed it. He was betting that I'd be too afraid of the consequences to follow through on my report. He was wrong. I've already compiled a full report, I said, meeting his stare. 400 pages of documentation showing how Meridian Consulting is being used to embezzle money from our clients. I was hoping you'd have an explanation that would make this all go away. Instead, you're threatening me. Gregory's facade cracked completely. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Hannah. No idea at all. Do you think this company runs on compliance reports and regulatory procedures? Do you think we compete with Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley by following every little rule to the letter? I think we compete by being trustworthy, by protecting our clients' interests, by doing the right thing. The right thing? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The right thing is keeping this company profitable and growing. The right thing is making sure our employees keep their jobs and our clients keep seeing returns. The right thing is not destroying everything we've built over some accounting technicalities. Embezzlement isn't a technicality. Gregory, it's a felony. And making false accusations against a senior executive is a career-ending mistake. I stood up, gathering my papers. I guess we'll find out which one of us is right. Hannah, wait. His voice had changed again, becoming almost pleading. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't you take the weekend to think about this? Consider all the angles, all the people who might be affected by wild accusations. Consider your own future in this industry. I've already thought about it, Gregory. I've thought about it for weeks. And what about your colleagues? Your friends here at Granite Oak? Do you want to be responsible for destroying their careers because you couldn't let sleeping dogs lie? I paused at the door. I want to be able to sleep at night knowing I did the right thing. As I walked back to my office, I could feel my hands shaking. The meeting had gone worse than I'd expected. Gregory hadn't just failed to provide an innocent explanation, he'd essentially confirmed my suspicions while simultaneously threatening my career and possibly my safety. The casual way he'd talked about arrangements and whatever it takes suggested that Meridian was just the tip of the iceberg. I had until Monday to decide what to do next. I could submit my report to senior management and hope they'd take it seriously. Or I could take Gregory's advice and drop the whole thing to protect my own career. The safe choice was obvious. The right choice was terrifying. I spent the weekend pacing around my apartment, replaying the conversation over and over. Gregory's words kept echoing in my mind. You have no idea what you're dealing with. What did that mean? How deep did this go? How many people were involved? By Sunday night, I'd made my decision. I would submit the report first thing Monday morning. I would give it to our CEO, David Morrison, and let him decide how to handle it. I would do my job, follow proper procedures, and trust that the system would work the way it was supposed to. I should have known better. Monday morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes Chicago winters legendary. I arrived at the office early, as usual, but instead of going to my floor, I took the elevator directly to the executive level. David Morrison's office was at the far end of the hall, behind doors that were usually guarded by his assistant and rarely open to anyone below the vice president level. I'd prepared a brief cover memo explaining my findings and recommending immediate action. The full report was in a sealed envelope, along with copies of all supporting documents. I'd practiced what I would say, how I would present the information in a way that would make it impossible to ignore or dismiss. But when I reached the executive floor, I found David's assistant waiting for me. Ms. Brooks? Mr. Morrison would like to see you in conference room A. He's waiting for you there. Something felt wrong immediately. David Morrison didn't hold meetings in conference room A. That was reserved for disciplinary actions and terminations. Moreover, how did he know I was coming? I hadn't scheduled an appointment or told anyone about my intention to submit the report. Conference room A was a sterile, windowless space furnished with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. When I entered, I found not just David Morrison, but also Gregory Walters, our head of human resources, Patricia Hernandez, and a man in an expensive suit whom I didn't recognize. David gestured for me to sit across from them. Hannah, thank you for coming in early. We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention. Concerns? I clutched the envelope containing my report. What kind of concerns? Gregory leaned forward. Hannah, we understand you've been conducting some kind of unauthorized investigation into company finances. We understand you've been accessing records outside your normal scope of responsibility and making serious accusations against fellow employees. I've been doing my job. I discovered evidence of embezzlement and... You've been exceeding your authority. Patricia interrupted. You've been acting unilaterally, without proper supervision, potentially compromising ongoing business relationships. The man in the expensive suit spoke for the first time. Ms. Brooks, I'm Robert Chen, the company's external counsel. I want to make sure you understand the serious legal implications of making false accusations against company executives. My heart was pounding. This wasn't how whistleblowing was supposed to work. I was supposed to report my findings, and then the company was supposed to investigate. Instead, I was being treated like a criminal before I'd even presented my evidence. I have documentation, I said, placing the envelope on the table. 400 pages of financial records showing systematic embezzlement through a shell company called Meridian Consulting. I haven't made any accusations, I've simply documented what I found. David reached for the envelope, but Gregory was faster. He picked it up, opened it, and began flipping through the pages. After a few minutes, he looked up with what seemed like genuine surprise. Hannah, this is impressive work, really impressive, but it's also completely wrong. Wrong how? Meridian Consulting is a legitimate contractor. They provide confidential competitive intelligence services that require a high level of discretion. The reason you can't find traditional contracts or statements of work is because their services are covered under separate confidentiality agreements. Then show me the agreements. Gregory and David exchanged glances. The agreements are confidential, David said. Even from our internal compliance department. That's the nature of the work they do. So you're telling me that you've authorized hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments to a company that I'm not allowed to audit or review? We're telling you that there are aspects of our business operations that are above your clearance level, Patricia said. Your job is to ensure compliance with regulations that apply to your department, not to investigate executive-level business relationships. I felt the world tilting around me. Are you seriously arguing that embezzlement is above my clearance level? We're arguing that you've misinterpreted legitimate business expenses as something sinister, Robert Chen said. And in the process, you've violated company policy, exceeded your authority, and potentially exposed the company to liability. Gregory held up my report. Hannah, this represents weeks of unauthorized investigation. You've accessed executive financial records without permission. You've made copies of confidential documents, and you've drawn conclusions that could damage the company's reputation if they were to become public. My job is to identify compliance violations. That's exactly what I've done. Your job is to follow proper procedures, Patricia said. When you have concerns about executive-level financial arrangements, you're supposed to bring them to your supervisor, not conduct independent investigations. I did bring them to my supervisor. I brought them to Gregory himself. And he explained that your concerns were unfounded, David said. At that point, you should have accepted his explanation and moved on. Instead, you've continued to pursue a conspiracy theory that could harm the company and its employees. I looked around the table at their faces. David Morrison, whom I'd always respected as an honest leader. Patricia Hernandez, who'd hired me and praised my work for 3 years. Robert Chen, whose job was to protect the company's interests. And Gregory Walters, who was sitting there with my report in his hands, looking like a man who'd just been vindicated. So what happens now? I asked. David sighed. Hannah, you're a talented compliance officer, but you've shown a serious lack of judgment in this situation. You've violated company policy, exceeded your authority, and potentially compromised confidential business relationships. We can't have employees conducting unauthorized investigations based on misunderstandings and conspiracy theories. Are you firing me? We're terminating your employment effective immediately, Patricia said. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay and continuation of your health insurance for 30 days. We'll provide a neutral reference for future employment opportunities. I felt numb. And my report? Gregory held it up, then walked to the paper shredder in the corner of the room. This report is based on false premises and unauthorized access to confidential information. For legal and security reasons, it needs to be destroyed. I watched my 400 pages of meticulous documentation disappear into the shredder, one sheet at a time. Weeks of work, months of investigation, hundreds of hours of careful analysis, all reduced to confetti in a matter of minutes. I need you to clean out your office under security supervision, Patricia said. And I need you to sign this non-disclosure agreement before you leave. She slid a document across the table. The NDA was comprehensive, forbidding me from discussing any aspect of my employment, my investigation, or my termination with anyone outside the company. It also included a non-disparagement clause that would prevent me from saying anything negative about Granite Oak or its employees. What if I don't sign it? Then you forfeit your severance pay and will be forced to pursue legal action for your unauthorized access to confidential information. Robert Chen said, We have grounds to argue that you violated your fiduciary duty to the company and potentially committed corporate espionage. Corporate espionage. For doing my job and trying to protect our clients from embezzlement. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. But I was trapped. I couldn't afford a legal battle with the company's lawyers, and I couldn't afford to lose my severance pay while I looked for new employment. I signed the NDA with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else. Security will escort you to your office, Patricia said. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings. The walk to my office felt like a death march. Everyone in the building seemed to be staring at me, whispering to each other about why I was being escorted by security. My colleagues looked confused and concerned, but I couldn't explain what was happening without violating the NDA I'd just signed. I packed my personal items into a cardboard box, family photos, a few books, the coffee mug my niece had given me for my birthday. Everything else, my computer, my files, my business cards, belonged to the company and had to stay behind. As I was leaving, my assistant Jennifer approached cautiously. Hannah, what's going on? Are you okay? I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to warn her about Gregory, about the corruption I'd discovered, about the way the company had closed ranks to protect a thief. But the NDA was clear, and I couldn't risk the legal consequences. I'm fine, I lied. Just time for me to move on to new opportunities. The security guard led me to the elevator, then rode down to the lobby with me. Other employees avoided eye contact, probably afraid they might be contaminated by whatever had gotten me fired. In the span of 2 hours, I'd gone from being a respected compliance officer to a pariah being escorted out of the building. I walked out into the Chicago cold with my cardboard box and my shattered career, knowing that Gregory Walters was probably already back in his office, celebrating his victory. He'd neutralized the threat I represented, destroyed the evidence I'd collected, and silenced me with legal threats and financial pressure. But as I stood on the sidewalk watching the Granite Oak building disappear into the gray November sky, I realized something that Gregory hadn't considered. He'd destroyed my report, but he hadn't destroyed my knowledge. He'd silenced me legally, but he hadn't silenced me completely. And most importantly, he'd made the mistake of assuming that I was just another corporate employee who would quietly disappear rather than risk everything to do the right thing. He was wrong about that too. I spent the first week after my termination in a daze. I'd wake up every morning expecting to get ready for work, then remember that I no longer had a job to go to. I'd applied for unemployment benefits, but they would only last so long. I'd started updating my resume, but how do you explain being fired from a compliance position without being able to discuss the circumstances? The NDA felt like a cage. I couldn't tell potential employers why I'd left Granite Oak, couldn't explain the investigation I'd conducted, couldn't even hint at the corruption I'd discovered. I was trapped in a legal straitjacket, forced to pretend that my firing had been routine rather than retaliatory. But I still had copies of everything. Before submitting my report, I'd saved digital copies to my personal laptop and cloud storage accounts. I'd also kept printouts of key documents at home, just in case. Gregory might have destroyed the official report, but the evidence still existed. I started researching my options. The NDA prevented me from discussing my findings with journalists or potential employers, but it didn't prevent me from reporting crimes to law enforcement. In fact, no contract could legally require someone to conceal evidence of federal crimes. I spent hours researching whistleblower protections, regulatory reporting procedures, and the specific laws governing financial crimes. I learned about the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower program, which provided both protection and financial incentives for people who reported securities violations. I learned about the False Claims Act, which protected employees who reported fraud against the government. I learned about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which specifically protected employees who reported financial crimes. The more I learned, the more confident I became that I had both the right and the responsibility to report what I'd discovered. Gregory and his allies at Granite Oak had used legal threats and financial pressure to silence me internally. But they couldn't stop me from fulfilling my duty to the law and to the investing public. I decided to submit my findings to the SEC. The Securities and Exchange Commission maintains an online portal for whistleblower complaints. It's designed to be secure and confidential, allowing people to report securities violations without fear of retaliation. I spent several days preparing my submission, recreating my original report using the documents I'd saved at home. The new report was actually better than the original. Having been through the termination process, I now had additional evidence of the company's willingness to retaliate against employees who reported misconduct. I could document how they'd destroyed evidence, threatened legal action, and used non-disclosure agreements to silence potential witnesses. I also had a clearer understanding of the scope of the problem. The conversation with Gregory had revealed that Meridian Consulting was just one example of the company's willingness to bend rules and ignore regulations. His comments about arrangements and whatever it takes suggested a culture of corruption that went far beyond simple embezzlement. On a cold December night, 3 weeks after my termination, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open to the SEC's whistleblower portal. I'd spent hours reviewing my submission, making sure every fact was accurate and every allegation was supported by evidence. I'd included copies of financial records, email communications, and expense reports that clearly documented the scheme I'd discovered. The portal required me to provide my contact information and agree to cooperate with any investigation that might result from my complaint. I knew that submitting the report would make me a target for retaliation, but I also knew that I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. At 3:17 a.m. on December 15th, I clicked Submit. The confirmation message appeared immediately. Your complaint has been received and assigned case number SEC 2023 WB7439. A representative will contact you within 30 days if additional information is needed. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my apartment, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. I'd done what I thought was right, but I had no idea what would happen next. The SEC receives thousands of complaints every year, and most of them probably don't result in significant action. There was a good chance that my report would disappear into some bureaucratic black hole, leaving me unemployed and legally vulnerable without accomplishing anything. But I'd done what I could. I'd reported the crimes I'd discovered to the appropriate authorities. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. The weeks that followed were agonizing. I continued looking for employment, but the job market for compliance officers was competitive, and my inability to explain the circumstances of my departure from Granite Oak made me a less attractive candidate. I burned through my savings, borrowed money from my parents, and watched my checking account balance shrink towards zero. I heard nothing from the SEC. No phone calls, no emails, no acknowledgement that my complaint was being investigated. The silence was deafening, and I began to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe Gregory had been right. Maybe I should have minded my own business and kept my head down. But then, in mid-January, I received a phone call that changed everything. Ms. Brooks, this is Agent Sarah Kim with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'm calling about complaint number SEC 2023 WB7439. Would you be available to meet with me this week? My heart started racing. Yes, absolutely. When and where? How about Thursday at 2 p.m.? There's a coffee shop called Grind Coffee on West Adams Street. Do you know it? I knew it. It was about 6 blocks from the Granite Oak building, in a busy area where a meeting wouldn't attract attention. I'll be there. Ms. Brooks, I want you to know that we take whistleblower complaints very seriously. We've reviewed your submission, and we'd like to discuss your findings in more detail. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my phone. The SEC was actually investigating. Someone had read my report, taken it seriously, and decided it was worth pursuing. For the first time in months, I felt like I'd made the right choice. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. I arrived at Grind Coffee 15 minutes early, ordered a cup of coffee I was too nervous to drink, and sat at a corner table where I could watch the door. At exactly 2 p.m., a woman in a dark business suit entered and looked around the cafe. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with an air of quiet competence that reminded me of myself. Ms. Brooks, I'm Agent Kim. We shook hands, and she sat across from me. Thank you for meeting with me. I know this situation has been difficult for you. Have you had a chance to review my complaint? I've reviewed it very thoroughly. Your documentation is extremely detailed and well organized. It's clear you put a lot of work into this investigation. And we have some additional questions. We'd also like to discuss your willingness to cooperate with a formal investigation. Over the next hour, Agent Kim walked me through my findings in detail. She asked about my investigative methods, my sources of information, and my interactions with Gregory Walters. She was particularly interested in the meeting where he'd essentially admitted to the scheme while threatening me to stay quiet. Ms. Brooks, based on your complaint and our preliminary review, we believe there's sufficient evidence to warrant a formal investigation. We'll be requesting documents from Granite Oak, interviewing key personnel, and conducting a comprehensive audit of their financial practices. What does that mean for me? It means you'll be protected under federal whistleblower statutes. It also means you may be called as a witness if we decide to pursue enforcement action. Will they know the investigation started with my complaint? We don't identify whistleblowers unless it's absolutely necessary for the investigation. But given your former position and the specific nature of the allegations, it's possible that Granite Oak will figure out you were the source. I thought about the NDA I'd signed, the legal threats, the way they'd destroyed my career to protect Gregory's scheme. I'm not afraid of them anymore. Agent Kim smiled. Good. Because we're going to need your help to build a case that will hold up in court. The investigation took 6 months. I met with Agent Kim and her team several times, providing additional documentation and testimony about what I'd discovered. I learned that they'd found even more evidence of misconduct than I'd originally uncovered. Meridian Consulting was just one of several shell companies Gregory had created to embezzle money from client accounts. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Over 5 years, Gregory had stolen nearly $3 million from client investments, using an elaborate network of fake contractors and fictitious expenses. He'd used the money to fund a lavish lifestyle that included luxury cars, expensive vacations, and a beach house in the Hamptons. But the most shocking revelation was that Gregory hadn't been working alone. Several other executives had been involved in the scheme, including the head of our trading desk and our senior risk management officer. They'd created a culture of corruption that permeated the entire company, with junior employees pressured to overlook irregularities and senior management actively participating in the cover-up. I also learned that I wasn't the first employee to discover evidence of the fraud. 2 other compliance officers had raised concerns over the years, only to be transferred to other departments or quietly terminated. The company had a systematic pattern of identifying and eliminating employees who posed a threat to their criminal enterprise. In June, Agent Kim called to tell me that the investigation was complete and that the SEC would be announcing enforcement action within the next few weeks. Ms. Brooks, I want you to know that your complaint was instrumental in breaking this case open. Without your documentation and testimony, we never would have been able to prove the scope of the fraud. What's going to happen to them? Gregory Walters and 3 other executives will be charged with securities fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. We're also pursuing civil penalties that could reach tens of millions of dollars. The company will likely face significant fines and regulatory sanctions. And the clients who were defrauded? There will be a restitution process. We're working with the court to establish a fund that will compensate victims for their losses. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was finally being served. But it had taken so long and cost so much. The clients who'd been defrauded had lost money they might never recover. The honest employees at Granite Oak would probably lose their jobs when the company collapsed under the weight of the scandal. And I'd lost a career I'd worked years to build. But Gregory Walters was going to face consequences for his crimes. That was something. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in July. I was sitting in my apartment, still unemployed, but finally starting to get interviews thanks to the whistleblower protections that prevented employers from discriminating against me. I'd managed to explain my departure from Granite Oak in terms that made me sound principled rather than problematic. My phone started buzzing with news alerts. SEC charges Chicago investment firm with $3 million fraud scheme. Granite Oak Holdings, executives arrested in embezzlement case. Federal agents raid downtown investment office. I turned on the news and watched live coverage of federal agents entering the Granite Oak building, the same building where I'd worked for 3 years, where I'd discovered the evidence that led to this moment, where I'd been humiliated and terminated for trying to do the right thing. The reporters were calling it one of the largest investment fraud cases in Chicago history. They interviewed former clients who'd lost their life savings, current employees who claimed they'd had no idea what was happening, and legal experts who predicted that Gregory and his co-conspirators would face decades in prison. I watched Gregory being led out of the building in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face pale with shock. Gone was the smooth confidence, the practiced charm, the casual arrogance that had made him so effective at manipulating people. He looked like what he was, a common criminal who'd been caught and was about to pay the price. The news coverage mentioned that the investigation had been prompted by a whistleblower complaint, but they didn't identify me by name. I was grateful for that anonymity. I didn't want to be known as the person who'd brought down Granite Oak. I wanted to be known as the person who'd done her job and protected innocent investors from criminal fraud. Over the following weeks, more details emerged. The FBI had found evidence of additional crimes, including tax evasion, money laundering, and witness intimidation. The scheme had been far more sophisticated than even I had realized, involving offshore accounts, fake documentation, and a network of accomplices that extended beyond Granite Oak. Several other employees were arrested, including Patricia Hernandez, who'd been helping to cover up the fraud by manipulating HR records and silencing potential whistleblowers. Even David Morrison, the CEO I'd once respected, was charged with conspiracy for his role in the cover-up. The company collapsed within a month. Client assets were frozen while the court tried to figure out what money was legitimate and what had been stolen. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. The Granite Oak name became synonymous with corporate corruption and investor fraud. I felt guilty about that. I knew that most of the employees had been honest people who'd had no idea what their executives were doing. They'd lost their jobs because of crimes they hadn't committed, investigations they hadn't caused, and corruption they hadn't participated in. But I also knew that staying silent would have been worse. Every day I delayed reporting what I'd discovered was another day that Gregory could have stolen more money from innocent people. Every week the fraud continued was another week that honest investors were being betrayed by people they trusted. I'd done what I had to do. I'd reported crimes to the appropriate authorities and cooperated with their investigation. I'd honored my duty to the law and to the investing public. I'd protected people who couldn't protect themselves. The trial began in October. I was called as a witness for the prosecution. And I spent 2 days on the stand explaining my investigation, my findings, and my interactions with Gregory. The defense lawyers tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee who'd fabricated evidence to get revenge on the company that had fired me. But the financial records spoke for themselves. The pattern of fraudulent transactions was clear and undeniable. The correlation between Gregory's expenses and the company's payments to shell companies was too obvious to dismiss. The evidence was overwhelming. Gregory was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The company was ordered to pay over $50 million in fines and restitution. I received a whistleblower award from the SEC, $450,000, representing 10% of the penalties collected from Granite Oak. It was more money than I'd ever had at one time, enough to pay off my student loans and buy a small house. But the money wasn't why I'd done it. I'd done it because it was right. Because innocent people deserve to be protected from criminals who'd abuse their trust. Because the financial system only works when there are people willing to speak up when they see wrongdoing. I found a new job at a smaller compliance firm, one that specialized in helping companies build ethical cultures and prevent fraud. My experience at Granite Oak, rather than being a liability, had become my greatest asset. I was the compliance officer who'd uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme and had the courage to report it. On a cold December morning, almost exactly a year after I'd submitted my complaint to the SEC, I drove past the building that had once housed Granite Oak Holdings. It was empty now, with "For Lease" signs covering the windows. The corporate logo had been removed, leaving only faded outlines on the glass facade. I parked across the street and sat in my car, looking up at the 12th floor where my office had been. I thought about the night I'd first discovered the suspicious payments to Meridian Consulting, the weeks I'd spent investigating Gregory's crimes, the moment I'd realized that everything I'd worked for was about to be destroyed. I thought about the meeting where Gregory had threatened me, the hearing where they'd fired me, the security guard who'd escorted me out of the building with my belongings in a cardboard box. I thought about the months of unemployment, the financial stress, the uncertainty about whether I'd ever work in compliance again. And I thought about the moment I'd clicked Submit on the SEC website, sending my complaint into the digital void and trusting that someone, somewhere, would care enough to investigate. A year later, Gregory Walters was in federal prison. His co-conspirators were facing their own consequences. The stolen money was being returned to the people it had been taken from. The culture of corruption that had infected Granite Oak had been exposed and destroyed. I'd lost my job, my savings, and my peace of mind. But I'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that when I'd been tested, when I'd been forced to choose between my career and my principles, I'd chosen correctly, I'd done the right thing, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As I drove away from the empty building, I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing you've honored your obligations to something larger than yourself. I'd been a compliance officer, and I'd complied with the most important regulation of all, the requirement to tell the truth, no matter what it cost. The building disappeared in my rearview mirror, but the lesson remained. In a world where powerful people can destroy careers and ruin lives to protect their secrets, someone has to be willing to speak up. Someone has to be willing to say that stealing is wrong, that lying is unacceptable, that the people who trust us with their money deserve better than to be betrayed by those they've chosen to believe in, that someone had been me. And despite everything it had cost, I was proud of that choice. The empty windows of Granite Oak Holdings reflected the winter sky, cold and gray and unforgiving. But somewhere in those reflections, I could see the ghost of the person I'd been when I'd worked there, naive enough to believe that doing the right thing would be easy, innocent enough to think that good people would always support you when you stood up to bad people. I wasn't that person anymore. I was harder, more cynical, more aware of how the world really worked. But I was also more certain of who I was and what I stood for. I was someone who would choose principle over profit, truth over comfort, justice over security. I was someone who would click Submit at 3 a.m. and trust that somewhere, someone would care enough to investigate. And I was someone who would do it again, without hesitation, if the situation demanded it. The building grew smaller in my mirror until it disappeared entirely. Just another piece of Chicago's skyline. But the choice I'd made would stay with me forever. A reminder that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that cost us everything and give us nothing in return except the knowledge that we've done what we had to do. Gregory Walters had thought he could silence me with threats and legal pressure. He'd thought he could destroy my evidence and make the problem disappear. He'd thought he could intimidate me into accepting his version of how business really worked. He'd been wrong about all of that. But most of all, he'd been wrong about who I was. I wasn't just another corporate employee who would quietly disappear to protect her own interests. I was a compliance officer who actually believed in compliance, a professional who took her obligations seriously, a person who understood that some things were more important than job security. I was someone who would fight back. And in the end, that had made all the difference.